welcome to the Sloth Investor podcast with your host, Mr. Sloth.
Hi, and welcome everyone. This is the second episode of the Sloth Investor, an investing podcast that will help you discover why I believe the humble sloth is the best animal to characterize successful investing. Join me as I discuss my investing philosophy, my 5 bedrock principles. Last week, I discussed simplicity, the first bedrock principle of the Sloth Investor. That means this week, it's the turn of low fees, okay? My second bedrock principle. You'll find out why I believe it's so important to ensure that you're paying low fees for your investments. And once again, I'm joined by Jay Prohaska. Jay, how are you? How's your week been?
My week has been fantastic, and actually I'm excited to be part of this discussion once again.
Fantastic, Jay. Fantastic. So much to talk about here with regards to low fees. It can be a real issue still for investors, despite the fact that over the past few years we've seen fees tumble down. It's still the fact that around the world, many people are paying too much, simply paying high fees for their investments, and it needs to stop.
When you say fees, what does that actually refer to? What does that mean when you're paying fees for your investment?
Yeah, it can relate to a whole matter of different things. It can be it could be fees for advice. It could be fees for the transaction. It can be management fees. There's a whole host of different fees that investors can end up paying. And it's a real problem. Let me tell you that. It's such a problem. Let me tell you about, for example, in the UK, many investors like to invest in what we call investment trusts. And within an investment trust, there are fees such as custody fees, management fees, transaction fees, brokerage fees, built-in product fees, cash payment fees, and so on. Okay, so you can see in the UK, there's a real issue there with investors just paying so many different types of fees that they're really maybe even not too sure about. So I know that's something we're going to discuss quite a bit further as we progress through today's episode.
All right. I feel even a little bit more learned after hearing that.
Fantastic, Jay. So as we discussed last week, the first bedrock principle of the Sloth Investor is simplicity. Therefore, it should naturally follow that a belief in simplicity, i.e. a less is more approach to investing, shouldn't require high fees. This line of thinking is correct and logical.
Many people, sadly, in my own reflection, I think that people still are paying high fees, even though that we know we should be paying low fees. People are paying high fees. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think a key reason for this is authority bias. So I really think it's the case that investors as a whole, there's so many biases that we can suffer from when investing. Okay, so it's really not difficult to understand how members of the public, particularly those with little prior knowledge of investing, can become duped into paying high fees to supposedly professional advisors. So as consumers, we are conditioned to believe that the greater we pay, the high quality the results will be. So in most walks of life, we place our confidence in the professionals. So naturally, if you require a tooth to be extracted, you visit a dentist. You experience back pain, you visit a doctor. Invariably, you'll walk away from a dental practice or doctor surgery feeling content. However, it's important to understand the distinct difference, Jay, between a field of investing and other professional domains. This is because the investing world is a prime example of when professionals may not achieve the best results.
You know, it's actually funny because I remember Andrew Hallam talking about how, well, an investment broker, someone who takes your money and invests it for you, might hit out of the park one year. The likelihood of them being able to repeat that on a consistent basis is very, very low. And I think it's around the neighborhood of 1%. That means 99% of the time, approximately, they won't be able to duplicate their strong success.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Andrew makes such a good point then. For those unfamiliar with Andrew's work, Andrew is the author of The Millionaire Teacher and more recently Millionaire Expert. And Andrew writes in great depth about the importance of a low fee structure, making sure that you become sleuth. So right now, the sloth is talking about turning sleuth, okay? And that's really important. Making sure you look at the fine detail, the fine print, and ensuring that what you pay isn't extortionate, okay? So low fees are so important because otherwise, high fees are going to really eat into your investment returns.
Now, You use the word sleuth, and it makes me think of a term you've used before, agents of persuasion. And perhaps you could help me in the audience clarify a little bit when you say agents of persuasion, and in another word you've used, impression amplifiers.
Yeah.
These are two things that perhaps I could use a little bit of clarification on.
Sure. Yeah. So when I think about many financial professionals, okay, I really think about these terms, agents of persuasion and impression amplifiers. So let me dig a little bit deeper into that. So when I think about the term financial professionals, automatically a series of images begin to whirl around in my mind. Images that I associate with these individuals: the smart suit, perhaps a briefcase, the utterance of a significant amount of jargon. I refer to these things as impression amplifiers, okay? You could say that it's akin to a peacock spreading its feathers, flexing its prowess. Therefore, it's easy to see how these elements, or what I call impression amplifiers, could compel a newbie investor to part with their hard-earned money. You know,
it's almost like they must know what they're talking about because look at how they're dressed. Or look at the car they're driving.
Absolutely, Jay. And this is what I mean by impression amplifiers. The smart car, the smart dress, maybe even the slick back hair. Okay, that's something funny that I picked up and Andrew wrote about recently, Andrew Hallam. Invariably, and I'm talking as a Brit here, but invariably they often seem to be middle-aged British guys who are these people who, you know, flex their financial feathers and have these things that they want to amplify. But you have to think about whether it's necessarily your best interest that they have in heart. So it's important to think about. So let's think about someone that has little, if any, prior experience of investing. So they recognize that they need their money to grow, but they're lacking. Therefore, they feel compelled to outsource their investments to an external source. However, let's spend a little bit more time considering what it is that they're lacking. What are they lacking? It could be multiple factors, and perhaps even a combination of all of them. They could simply be lacking the confidence to invest. So perhaps there's no prior history of investing in their family. They may seriously question whether investing is really for them. Asking questions like, am I cut out for investing? Is this something I should do with my money? So as I spoke about on last week's podcast, we can really see how easily the imposter syndrome could take hold of someone in this situation. So for someone that has never invested before, taking that first step is indeed one giant leap. However, I would argue that the decisive factor that is lacking is knowledge. A significant amount of people simply do not possess the knowledge about how they can invest in a sloth-like manner. And this is where you and I can help, Jay.
And you know what? Two words you've used that I want to touch upon: lacking. When I first was investing with one of those sort of offshore plans that charge astronomical fees, I think, which we're going to sort of touch upon later in the podcast, in your podcast and podcast series, I took my contract, which was like a 20-year contract, and I took it to a banker friend, and he said, while this is legally allowed, morally, what you've been locked into is reprehensible. So you use the word lacking. And I almost might say that many investors who charge a lot of high fees perhaps are lacking a little bit of morality, because this is essentially my retirement money. This is money for my kids. And when they charge such high fees, and it's very unlikely that I'm going to stand to gain from anything, I would say they might be even lacking some morality.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It makes me I actually think back to my mum now. My mum growing up would have tons of quotes and phrases and pictures on her fridge, just like something like she liked to do to kind of pass the time. One of the quotes that always sticks in my mind and continues to resonate with me to this day is, there's no pillow as soft as a clear conscience. And you know, when I think about what you're just saying about morality and the decisions that many of these financial professionals, advisors are taking in terms of recommending these kind of investment, almost like insurance-linked products that have such high fees, you have to think to yourself, you know, how soft is their pillow? Is their pillow that soft? Okay. There's no pillow as soft as a clear conscience. So what you just said really, really, you know, makes me think back to that quote on my mum's fridge growing up. So yeah, it's interesting. Another
word you used was knowledge. And when I think about knowledge, actually, and again, we keep referring back to Andrew Hallam, and then this is sort of my some of my reading where I've gone a bit in depth. He highlighted a series that was in the paper here in Hong Kong, the SCMP, where the brokers who were advising people at banks were actually not trained brokers, but rather they were trained salespeople. And in my opinion, when you have people who are trained in how to get sales and commissions, they're lacking perhaps the knowledge and know-how on how a real investment would benefit you as the investor.
That's a really good point, Jay. There's that kind of conflict of interest. So on one hand, you've got that sales-oriented approach, but fundamentally, we need to think about the investor, okay, particularly if it's a newbie investor, what they want. They want to make sure that they're investing in a safe quality product, low fees. And when you have someone who's kind of trained with that sales-oriented background, we can see there a real conflict of interest. So yeah, thanks for raising that, Jay. It's a really good point.
You used to work at a school in the Middle East. You've got a statistic that I find incredible.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more? Can you explain upon that for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely, Jay. When I read this statistic recently, it's just...
Sorry, a statistic.
That's okay, Jay. No problem. No, it blew my mind. It absolutely blew my mind. So I used to work in the Middle East, and I recently read that alongside China, the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, has the most international schools in the world. So it sounds crazy for such a relatively small country, but the UAE, wait for it, has now over 550 English-speaking schools. Okay, so that's great for parents that want their child to receive an international education, to begin to open the right doors in life, such as acceptance at elite universities, lucrative careers, well-paid jobs, and so on. But let's consider another key stakeholder, the teachers themselves. So the Sloth Investor used to work at an international school in Dubai, in the UAE, and it's easy to see the magnetic pull, the attractiveness to teachers, particularly young teachers in their 20s, of a place such as Dubai. I worked with many teachers in this age group that were from the UK, Canada, Australia, the US, New Zealand, South Africa. So, Friday brunches, pool parties, a large expat community. It sounds like a dream gig for many expats, particularly the Brits who are just a 7-hour plane ride away from their home country.
Let me get this straight. You're earning a tax-free salary in Dubai. How could anything go wrong?
That is a great question and a very important one. It sounds too good to be true. You're young and you're earning a tax-free salary in Dubai. Well, I'm going to tell you something. You see, there are some serious predatory sharks that circle the waters in the Persian Gulf.
Predatory sharks. Okay, go a little bit more in depth. What do you mean by that?
All right, no problem, Jay. So let me just say they're predatory sharks of the financial kind.
Now, that kind I have come across.
I know. Tell me about it. And let me tell you a little bit more about these predatory sharks, okay? So first of all, let's consider what we have. Once again, we have a young professional with more disposable income than they were used to in their home country, okay? Be they British, Canadian, American, South African, you get the picture. However, they're generally unable to invest by using the brokerages and regulated financial institutions of their home country because of their status as an expat. So let's also throw in the fact that many of these people may possess little, if no, knowledge about investing.
Okay, so let me check off my list here. High disposable income? Yes. Little experience of investing? Yes. An inability to use regulated financial institutions? That's another check. That sounds probably like almost, you might say, it's a deadly recipe.
Jay, I think you'd be right there. I think it is a recipe. It sure is. I would argue that it's a recipe for financial mismanagement. So over the last decade, I've read countless stories about expatriates in the Middle East that have fallen prey to what Andrew Hallam, author of The Millionaire Teacher, refers to as snakes in suits. I love that phrase, snakes in suits. So for those unfamiliar, Andrew is the author of The Millionaire Teacher and The Millionaire Expat. So this is what Andrew has to say on these snakes in suits. Okay, so begin quote. This is Andrew's words. In the Middle East, financial salespeople can earn massive upfront commissions at the expense of the unfortunate souls that buy their products. These are large firms. They offer a variety of services and products, but snakes in suits love their highest commission paying investment schemes. I have yet to see an investment portfolio from such a firm that has beaten inflation over a period of 10 years or longer. Such commission-hungry carnivores sell horrible investment products. End quote. Okay, so listeners, you'll find a link to the article that I got this quote from in the Substack description for this podcast. So now to his credit, Andrew Hallam has visited the Middle East on numerous occasions, running workshops on investing to expatriates and also to high school students, like I mentioned last week. So these people are the fortunate ones. They've learned how they can invest their money in a low fee manner.
Okay, so previously you used a really interesting analogy with me. You talked to me about expatriates being very similar to antelopes and lions. And I think that probably the listeners would benefit from hearing this analogy. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, thanks for reminding me, Jay. Thank you about that. Yeah, so where to begin with that? So, it's not uncommon in the Middle East for schools to invite these predatory sharks that we've spoken about to their school.
And many times unbeknownst to them.
Absolutely. And the purpose is so that they can pitch their financial products to a collection of unassuming expatriate teachers. So in my opinion, viewing a group of expatriates in a room with these supposed financial professionals is akin to a herd of antelopes being surrounded by a small pride of lions. So with good fortune, you know that most of the antelopes will evade capture, but there will inevitably be some that will be caught and henceforth devoured, or in the case of the expatriate lacking in investment knowledge, financially devoured.
And I have to say, unfortunately, I've been at a school before that it's almost like inviting the vampire into your house. They've invited them to come. The admin thought it would be a good idea for teachers to understand how teachers could invest their money. And unbeknownst to the admin, they had invited this sort of snake oil salesman into our school. And unfortunately, I signed up with such snake oil salesmen. And much to my own dismay, I can say it's pretty grisly stuff.
It is grisly stuff. And, listeners, you can't see what I'm doing there, but I was just shaking my head, shaking my head at the thought of so many young expatriates, any age expatriates, really suffering as a result of having to sign up to these investment schemes that are very common in the Middle East and other places that charge such high fees. So I guess, Jay, you can forget about Nightmare on Elm Street. Forget Nightmare on Elm Street. It's more like Nightmare on Expat Street.
That's probably an accurate way to look at it. So perhaps now is a good time to remind our listeners, what does a sloth investor believe in? Sorry, sleuth?
Yeah, sloth.
I gotta get that. I've got to get that pronunciation right. How does it go again?
I think it's sloth because I
Okay.
recently watched a documentary of David Attenborough and he said sloth, and it kind of reminds me of the speed of sloth. But it's like, hey, Jake, I'm an open-minded guy. I'm open to sloth. I hear many other people say sloth. I'm open-minded. It's not a big detail for me. It's not a massive problem. I'm open-minded.
So what is a sloth investor, putting the North American slant on it, sloth investor believe in?
I like it, Jay. So fundamentally, okay, let me be clear about what the Sloth Investor advocates. In fact, I'll read straight from my Twitter profile right now. So the Sloth Investor believes in passive index fund investing and buying and holding quality companies for the long term. So while I use both approaches, I recognize that for the majority of people, investing their money in a low fee, globally diversified index fund is the best approach. Many of my close friends and colleagues have informed me that they have neither the time nor inclination to research individual stocks. So for these people, a hands-off, inactive index approach to investing will be best. Now, at this stage, I've got a few recollections of my time in the Middle East. During my time there, many of my colleagues were visited by the predatory sharks that I referred to earlier. I'm aware that several of them mentioned index funds to these so-called financial professionals.
Really? And what was the reaction to this?
Well, Jay, you watched Superman as a kid, right?
Absolutely.
Do you remember Superman's reaction to kryptonite?
Yeah, he looked like a broken man and pretty much a sorry sight.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. It was a sorry sight indeed. Poor Superman. Okay, so let me talk about the connection. Let me tell you. Well, according to what I heard, the mere mention of index funds to many of these finance guys in the Middle East is similar to the reaction that Superman has to kryptonite. So beginning to discuss the merits of index funds makes them feel uneasy. They want to get away from it, to change the subject. They want to pirouette away from questions about costs, so much so that it begins to look like ballet.
you gotta keep it simple, right?
Yeah.
You gotta simplicity. That's the first letter in the Sloth Investor. Simple. Let's talk about simple. I don't know, low fee, globally diversified ways for people to invest.
Exactly. So for the investor that just wants to have that simple investing approach, okay, they can simply buy a low fee index fund that is globally diversified. Okay. So I know that when Andrew Hallam visited the Middle East, okay, during his workshops and lectures, he would discuss how expats who don't really want to take the time to research individual stocks, browse sites such as Seeking Alpha, Moleeful, if they really want a hands-off, couch potato, less is more approach to investing, they can simply buy a low-fee, globally diversified index fund. Okay, but you're right in what you say about the fact that such an approach is simply not going to line the back pockets of these kind of financial professionals and advisors that you tend to see in many countries, particularly in the Middle East region. So it reminds me of that classic investing text, Where Are the Customers' Yachts by Fred Schwed. Hope I'm pronouncing Fred's name correctly there, his second name. So for those unfamiliar with this book, let me read the opening page, okay? Open quote. Once in the dear dead days beyond recall, an out-of-town visitor was being shown the wonders of the New York financial district. When a party arrived at the Battery, one of his guides indicated some handsome ships riding at anchor. He said, "Look, those are the bankers' and brokers' yachts." "Where are the customers' yachts?" asked the naive visitor. End quote.
And that's so perfect. I've read that quote before, and I absolutely love that quote because it spells it out perfectly, right? It's a great analogy. One of the things I've noticed, and if I can change gears for a second here, is that I was confused when I first met with my sort of shark in a suit. He threw at me a lot of jargon, things I didn't understand, and I just almost sadly trusted everything he believed. Everything he sold me, everything he told me. He must know what he's talking about because he's got these big words. He's using a lot of jargon, which I don't completely understand. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure do, yes. So I know we've spoken about how an excessive use of jargon from financial professionals can cause newbie investors to feel disempowered. That is, it makes people feel that they have to pay high fees because this use of jargon makes them feel that the domain of investing is just too complex for them. Therefore, this kind of gives them some sort of justification to outsource their investments and subsequently pay higher fees than they really should. So there's a phrase from the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw that is pretty apt in this respect. He created a phrase, a conspiracy against the laity, and it was used in his play, The Doctor's Dilemma. So essentially, a conspiracy against the laity refer to the methods used by professionals to acquire wealth, power, and prestige. So who are the laity that George Bernard Shaw refers to? Well, it's the layperson, the person with little or no expertise. Now, the domain of investing can be made complex and crammed full of jargon, and this is where the investment professionals that we've spoken about begin to play a role.
Now,
you
go ahead. Finish what you're talking about.
Sure. So when something is made difficult to understand for a layperson, it automatically becomes a need for experts who subsequently charge high fees because they can sort everything out for you to help you tackle the complexity. This is what is meant by a conspiracy against the laity.
Right. And I think it's important for the listeners to know that there's a desire on the part of the broker to charge high fees. This is in their own self-interest. And it makes me think about their yachts and the yachts that I helped paid for the one broker who I invested with. I guess going along the lines of nautical disasters, do you want to talk a little bit about the sort of iceberg analogy that you mentioned to me recently as well?
Sure, yeah. So I guess you could say that there's a connection to Titanic and that gargantuan iceberg.
You're doing it again. Whenever we get in together and we talk about investing, we end up making references to movies. Superman, the latest one. You talked about the movie Heat last week, and Pacino and De Niro. And what about Nightmare on Elm Street? I have this vision in my head about Nightmare on Elm Street, and you use the term
Nightmare on Expat Street.
Yeah, you go Nightmare on Expat Street, and I coming back to the nautical disasters, I recently watched the movie Titanic with my kids.
Yeah.
And I can't help but think of the movie Titanic for some of these situations that could loan itself well to that.
Yeah, so you've got a good point, Jay. Who knew there were so many parallels between investing and the world of cinema? So the analogy that I want to make here with regards to the Titanic and icebergs is how we can think about the transparency, or you could say lack of transparency with regards to fees. So roughly 90% of an iceberg is under the water, meaning that much of the iceberg is of course hidden from view. And the analogy to fees I think is pretty apt. So this is because newbie investors could potentially fall prey to paying a ton of hidden fees if they're not careful. This continues to be a major problem in the UK. There's a whole host of fees that investors can incur as a result of one's investment in a typical investment fund in the UK. So at the top of this episode, I spoke about custody fees, management fees, transaction fees, brokerage fees, built-in product fees. There are so many. There's a ton of fees that investors end up paying that aren't immediately observable and transparent. So what compels my fellow Brits to pay such fees? Well, there's several factors at play. Firstly, there's still a lack of emphasis on investment in education in the UK. So if someone hasn't developed even a basic understanding of investing, they're likely to be subject to authority bias. That's what I spoke about earlier. This then leads them to paying high fees. Also, another key problem in the UK is that there's been a huge push in recent years to persuade people to buy investment trusts. The majority of investors using them are paying very high fees for dismal performance. The British print media has played a decisive role here too, Jay. I regularly read a variety of British broadsheet newspapers, and it's customary to read articles that advocate an investment in these poor-performing investment trusts.
And speaking from my own experience, I thought the broker sold me on the idea that I'm putting my money offshore. And I'm embarrassed that I didn't pay attention closely to the fee. So when okay, I'm going to tell you guys a story. It's a bit embarrassing for me. So when I was looking at all the fees, and you talked about so many of them, and it wasn't until it was pointed out to me by this banker friend who took me out and told me that the contract I had signed was morally reprehensible. But I was adding up the holding fee, the investment charge, and the break fees, and all these other fees that just kept adding up. And it was, quickly adding up to around 10, 12, 15%, all these different fees. And I thought, well, that's not bad. It's only 15% of my profits. And he said, no. You can hope to make on average about 8% a year. And if you're paying 10% a year in fees, that means I'm going to be losing 2% a year off my investment. And that's what my big light bulb moment sort of went off, that it's completely unnecessary for people to believe that they need to pay high fees to get a return on their investment.
Absolutely right, Jay. You make a really good point there. Those numbers are startling. They really are. So I think you and I have been pretty comprehensive in what we've covered, but I just love to use a quote from Jack Bogle, who sadly passed away in 2019. But for those unfamiliar with the name, Jack Bogle was the founder of the Vanguard Group and the father of the index fund. Okay, so this is what he has to say on fees. Performance comes and goes, but costs roll on forever.
Now, perhaps that would be a fitting way with Vanguard sort of being as you said, the father of low-cost fees. Perhaps that would be a fitting way for us to sort of draw to conclusion our second podcast, which is also centered around the second bedrock principle of the Sloth Investor, which is low fees, L for low fees.
Fantastic, Jay. It's just a really, really important bedrock principle. So we looked at simplicity in episode 1, low fees, episode 2, and in next week's episode, we're going to be looking at owning the world, the importance of making sure that your portfolio is globally diversified. So we're going to wrap things up there. It's been great to get together again, Jay, and I cannot wait to meet again for episode 3. It's been a blast.
Sounds great, everybody. Thanks very much for tuning in. And if you like this podcast, don't forget to press subscribe.
So long, everyone. Bye for now.
For more tips, follow the Sloth Investor on Twitter at Sloth_Investor.